Very much. Lovely to be here. Can you hear me? It's okay, is it? Can everybody else? Can everyone hear me? That's good. Lovely to be here. I've been asked to talk about carers and their rights, and I'm very happy to take questions. It's always problematical when you take questions because half the people want to ask a question, half the other people don't want anybody to ask questions, they want somebody to talk. So it's a difficult thing, but I think it actually makes it much more interesting if we have discussion. But sometimes, as Anne says, we may have to sort of park it if it gets too involved. But please do interject. It's also quite a long period. We're going to have sort of just over 2 hours. So if you feel like standing up, stretching your legs and going for a stroll, please do. I'm used to judges walking out whilst I'm addressing them, or students walking out, so I'm not fazed by that. Please don't stand on ceremony. So I'm going to talk about carers and their rights, and it's something that I'm really fascinated by. It's something I've spent well over 20 years being involved in. And I'm involved in it as a solicitor, as an academic. I teach at a law school, as has been said, but I also spend half my life still as a solicitor. I used to be a solicitor many years ago in Hereford, where I still live, just down, used to say down the road, but it's down the river at the moment, and spent lots of happy days suing local authorities and health boards. Seldom Shropshire, I think, not in relation to community care, because I'm sure they're wonderful. But so I ride those two horses. What I wanted to do is to start off by looking at really the big picture, and then the small picture, the macro and the micro. Technically, I know probably as much as anybody does, and it's only because it's a very small area of law, about carers and law, because actually I've been involved in drafting some of it. But also, each year for Carers UK, we write a book on this called Carers and Their Rights. And this one's coming out actually next week. And you can download that free from the internet. It's about 110 pages or something like that. And you can get it from my website, or just Google it and you'll get that. So that's a book that's full of all the detail of the law. It's free on the internet. I think there's going to be a web, some clever sort of ebook or something that's free. And it's got the sort of technical detail, the devil of the detail, if you need to know stuff about flexible working or rights specifically on access to information, or parent carers or young carers or adult carers. But I'm going to rake through that briefly today, but that's there. I've also got a newsletter which I've put over there, which has got stuff. I write a very big book, which you certainly shouldn't buy, which is the sort of book the courts use and the lawyers use on community care. But inside there's a copy of that carers book, which is free. And there's also a book we do, which is quite a big book, called Disabled Children, if you're involved in that area. Education, social care, health care, transitions, capacity, which is also free on the internet, so you can download that as well. So that's the detailed stuff, and that's got lots of footnotes to sort of court cases and ombudsman's cases and bits of statute. I really want to start with the big picture, because I think the big picture is fascinating, and it's not as bleak as the small picture. And it's what we in academia, really, I suppose, call the policy memory. And it requires you to be sort of old like me, to have a long enough period of being involved in this to see things coming around again that were around before. We are living in a difficult period. No doubt about it. The UK has it has a net structural debt of about 60% of our gross domestic product. So what does that mean? Well, it means it's big. And we've never been in a situation ever like this before. Well, that's true if you're 21, but if you're a bit older than that, you realise that, of course, we have been in situations like this many times before. At the end of the Second World War, we didn't have a structural debt of 60% of GDP. We had a structural debt of 180% of GDP. It was 3 times worse than it is today. We also had 3 million houses destroyed, and our industry was on its knees. At that stage, we didn't slash and burn as a country. We didn't cut, which is what is happening now. We did something quite different. We brought in some quite interesting legislation. We brought in a thing called the Education Act 1944, which brought free education not only just to primary school but to secondary education, which was an enormous leap forward. Shropshire County Council will spend half its budget on education. It's the single biggest thing it spends its money on. We brought in a thing called the National Insurance Act 1946. National insurance, pensions, contributory and non-contributory pensions for disabled people, ill people, maternity benefits, sickness benefits. Pensions are the biggest thing. I mean, national insurance is the biggest thing that nice Mr. Osborne spends our money on each year. It's £270 billion, by far the biggest budget item. We brought in a quaint little thing called the National Health Services Act, 1946, free healthcare at the point of need. The NHS is the second most expensive thing the United Kingdom spends its money on, £110 billion. Employs 1.4 million people, the third biggest organisation in the world. And over coffee we can discuss the other two. And we brought in the thing called the National Assistance Act, which is the act that places a duty on social services, county councils in this case, to provide social care for elderly, ill, disabled people. And social care is the second biggest item of a county council's budget. We brought in the 4 most expensive things the UK does, nationally and locally, at a time when our debt was 3 times worse than it is today. In fact, it rose to 4 times worse at the beginning of the 50s. And we did that because we had a very different attitude. We didn't elect, as we do in England, governments that don't believe in that sort of stuff. We, at the end of the Second World War, my parents did, although they deny ever voting for that government, but somebody must have voted for it. We had a belief in a very different world. We had a belief in a thing called a traditional welfare state. And we had that because we had an idea, a Beveridge, Sir William Beveridge had the idea, or he developed an idea, that the state would be not just a war state fighting fascism, but when that was over, it would be a big state, but it would fight evil, what he called the 5 giants, the giant of want, of ignorance, of disease. And we would slay these with the National Insurance Act, would slay the giant of disease. The Education Act would slay the giant of ignorance. And curiously, the giant of squalor would be slain by the National Assistance Act, the act I'm going to talk about, because it's the act that underpins social care. And the idea behind the traditional welfare state is that it provides for everybody. If you study the welfare state, you understand that it can only work properly if it provides for the middle classes, curiously. It's an expensive state, but it is a fairly open texture state. It doesn't have very complex rules because it is fairly generous. But it costs. And that's a problem the English electorate seem to have a problem with. Now, somewhere along the line, somewhere in 1970s, we had a choice we could make. We could either go the modern welfare state way, develop our traditional welfare state into a modern welfare state, which is what really Northern Europe did, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany. Or we could go the residual way, the way of the Americans and the Australians, where you have a state that just provides for the poor. If you do that, it's theoretically cheaper, but it has to have very, very complex rules to exclude everybody. So instead of giving a benefit like child benefit to everybody, you then start means testing it, and that's actually very complicated. And we decided to go the residual way, and we have been going that way ever since. Cutting and cutting, particularly in social care. Social care is the one area, I mean, housing's gone pretty well completely in the public sector, but in social care, it's the one area that has been cut. And if you look at my newsletter, which I've got there, there's a very interesting graph in it, in the third page, and you'll see that there's two lines, one going down, one going up. And what that shows you is that in the last 20 years, the number of people getting help from social services has dropped every year. It's dropped dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years, but it was dropping ever since 1993. Now, that's very odd. You'd think that in the last 20 years, the number of people getting help from social services would increase because, of course, there's a lot of old people around. When the welfare state was formed, old people did the decent thing. They died when they got to 60. But now they don't. They just sort of bleed us dry. They carry on living. And we're always told it's terrible. You know, we've got this awful problem they call the demographic time bomb. So you'd expect, and we've got quite a lot of disabled children surviving that didn't used to survive because they were low birth weight, coming through with some disabilities. So the amount of morbidity in the population is actually increasing quite significantly. So you'd expect more people to get social care, but they don't. The number has dropped dramatically. And we'll see as I quickly go through that there are services they used to get that were routine, like housework, like holidays, actually. I just don't do those anymore. So we've abolished, we are cutting services because social care is the one area that is on its knees. Massively short of money. So what's happening? Well, of course, the answer is what's happening is that these elderly ill people, these people with dementia, these people with profound learning disabilities, are not being left on the streets. They're being looked after, but they're not being looked after by the state. They're being looked after by carers. During the last 20 years, the most dramatic thing that's happened in relation to carers, because when we talk about carers, it's highly gendered, it's women, actually. And that's the key thing about carers. So there are, obviously men are carers, but if you look at caring as if you look at what we call dependency work, it's highly gendered. And because it's highly gendered, it's very low paid, because women do not get good salaries. So even if a man is doing that, it is low paid work. In the last 20 years, the middle classes in this country really haven't had any increase in income, curiously. Very odd, but it hasn't increased. The way households have survived in the last 20 years is that women have gone back into work, and there's been a 14% increase in women in work. So in the last 20 years, you've seen women having to go back into work, part-time work. You've seen the state pulling away services. And therefore, you've got... Anne was saying, things are stretched. Well, actually what's stretched are carers, because they're largely working, and they're taking the strain from this cutback. And my view is that they're stretched as far as you can go. They really are as stretched as far as they can go. And the state can't carry on those two games much longer. I'm writing a paper. I often used to say, I've just finished this paper, but I'm being honest now, I haven't finished it. But I do have to finish it because I'm doing a big presentation on it, called Does Your Carer Take Sugar? Because it's mimicking a radio program, some of you will know, that started in the 70s called Does He Take Sugar?, which was about disabled people. And it was a very provocative title in the 70s, because in the 70s there was a sort of stereotype about disabled people, that they were crippled people that sat in the corner and you talked about them because they couldn't possibly talk for themselves or make decisions for themselves. In the 70s, the disabled people's movement was getting going. It was getting going because of Vietnam, largely. A lot of highly educated, reasonably well-off people coming back who were conscripts in Vietnam, coming back injured and getting very cross. And there's a classic image of the philosophy they adopted then. They were angry, they felt that they were excluded, and they started saying they weren't disabled because they had no legs. They were handicapped by the environment around them. And the classic picture for that is a book cover by somebody called Michael Oliver called The Politics of Disablement. It's a man in a wheelchair, and in front of him is a flight of steps, and at the top of the steps it says polling station. Because he couldn't vote, not because disabled people were incapable of voting, he couldn't vote because of the environment we're creating. Once you've got a radicalised group of people who self-associate, who feel oppressed, and they have a philosophy, you then have a radical movement. In the 70s, we never expected the disabled people to become protected under the disability discrimination legislation, but then 20 years later they got an act. Now they have a UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They have become the objects. And what I'm saying in this article is carers are in exactly the same position today. They are oppressed by the social conditions. They're oppressed by neoliberalism, by countries that believe you can take away the safety net of the welfare state, say there's only one route out of poverty, and that's work. And that catches a group, it catches carers. They have to look after them. And they're becoming radicalised, and they're seeing that, in fact, their quite severe social exclusion, because 500,000 of carers in the UK are some of the most socially excluded people, is being caused by not science or inevitability, but by the sort of structures we have. So carers are the political group. They are the fascinating group, and they are beginning to identify, and they will be given very clear protection within 3 or 4 years under the equalities legislation. But what I'm going to say today is that they already have some protection because we've moved that way. So that's the big picture. If you're employed in carers work, you've guaranteed a job for the rest of your life, because the government knows that's the group of people you've got to say nice, honeyed words to. You've got to pass bits of legislation that sound nice, because they're the group that are really stretched, and they're getting a bit cheesed off with that, I think. So, there's Trustee Sir William. Now, one of these great acts was the National Assistance Act. It's an act that is often overlooked, but it's an act that I like very much. It's the only one of those statutes that's still in force. All the others have been modernised, codified, but the old National Assistance Act is still there. Why do I love it so much? The Law Commission recently told me that I'm the only person they've ever come across that likes this act. The act's got some bad things about it. It uses some sort of naughty language. It talks about crippled people, handicapped by congenital deformity. It uses medical model languages. But it's a great act because it does two things. One, it says that once a local authority's decided you need something, it's got to provide it, full stop. It's got to do it. So it packs a punch legally. Once you've been decided you need something, it's got to be provided, full stop. We'll see that local authorities are massively short of money. They are massively short of money in social care. So they play all sorts of naughty games. I'm sure they don't in Shropshire, but in other counties they do all sorts of naughty things. They have waiting lists, they have panels, they have all sorts of things that they're not allowed to have, because the law says once you've decided you need it, you've got to do it. That's a great thing. And the moment there's a bill going through Parliament that will change this, it's to codify it, hopefully, but hopefully it won't take that away. If we've got time, we can talk very briefly about that bill, because that bill is going to make quite significant changes to carers law. The government says that it will improve things, but I distrust governments, and so I think we all need to be very aware of this bill. It's called the Care and Support Bill. Yeah, sorry, please interject as well. Yeah, but thanks, Liz. The other thing that's great about this Act is that I do a Master's in Social Care Law at Cardiff. You've got to come. This is a promotional interlude. I've got some leaflets there. But one of the things we do is we ask the students to look at the debates in 1947 when this government is debating that change. It's an extraordinary government in 1947. It's the one and only time in the history of the United Kingdom we've had a government, a cabinet composed of people who had been poor. You know, we had an R. and Bevan, we had Ernest Bevan, we had Shinwell, people that had worked in the mines, worked in the shipyards, and they knew what it was like to experience the system then, because the system then was the Poor Law. And the Poor Law said you couldn't get any help from the borough council, the parish, unless you could show you were destitute. And to show you were destitute, you had to have no money, you had to be paraded before the justices to show you had no suitable outer garments or undergarments. So elderly people were paraded before the justices and show their underclothes, to show they had no decent underclothes or spare underclothes. But they also had to show that they had no relations near or far who could support them. And so there was what was called the liable family rule, the filial responsibility rule, as the Americans call it. And the Poor Law Commissioners would go far and wide to see if there were family members that had money, children who could support their parents or their elderly relatives or their mentally ill sister or learning disabled brother. And only if you could show that you were destitute and you had nobody that had money that would support you, could you get help. And of course you then went into the workhouse. The workhouse existed, in fact, until the 5th of July 1948. It existed in name until 1933. In 1933 they changed the name, but the institution still existed. And if you listen to the debates in 1947, there's this hatred for that system because the people who were then in power had experienced that. I mean, not personally, but they had seen it. And so we did something very unique on the 5th of July 1948 when this Act came into force. We abolished the Poor Law. And with it, we abolished the liable family rule. And there's what it looked like in 1601, because, of course, the Poor Law existed since 1531. And it's an incredibly important thing. For much of the world, there is still a liable family rule. But we in this country, because we had this unusual system of the Poor Law before, we abolished it. And I'm often having to tell senior social workers, I've got a lot of time for frontline social workers, but my time diminishes as they go up the ladder to some extent, because as you go up the ladder, you have to balance budgets more. But I'm often telling senior social workers that my client doesn't have to care for her 20-year-old learning disabled son. You know, we abolished the liable family rule on the 5th of July 1948, Ducky, and it's not my client's duty. We said it was the state's duty to care for elderly, ill and disabled people. And that's how it should be, because it's a card that you are, you know, it's a wild card. Some people go through life without any caring whatsoever, and some people spend their life caring. Some people go through life without any caring responsibilities at all and end up saying their hard-earned cash should be kept for them and their children and they should be able to, you know, do what they like with it. But we forget hard-working, caring families who never work in the paid sense, but spend their life caring, and then, of course, have a future of poverty because they don't get paid for that, they don't get proper social security benefits, and they don't have a pension to rely on. So we said it's the state's duty to cover that issue. When we abolished the liable family rule, of course, carers didn't stop caring, because it's a fact of humanity that we do it. In fact, as I've already said, we have more carers today than we've ever had. We've got 6.5 million carers in the United Kingdom, far more than 20 years ago. Because although we've abolished the liable family rule, you do not have to care for adult family members, even your spouse. The state has slowly withdrawn those services, but people have always cared, and they will always care. Even in the modern welfare states of Northern Europe, there's a huge amount of caring, because that's what we do. It's hardwired into nearly all of us. So the good old National Assistance Act abolishes the liable family rule. The state does it. So every carer's assessment should start with a statement that the assessing authorities, the social services authority, do not assume, they make no assumption that the carer is willing or able to provide or continue to provide care, because they simply don't have to do it. And so the question is, this is what this disabled person needs, this elderly person, this ill person needs. This is the care package they would need. What are you willing or able to do to help provide this care plan, basically? And so carers often say, well, I'm happy to do this, this and this, but I can't do that, or whatever. We'll look at that. And that's what the state's obligation is. The state looks at the totality of need, and then it discusses with the carers which bits of that they're prepared to do, they're willing to do, they're able to do. And the state has the underpinning responsibility. Now, the National Assistance Act, lovely act that it is a relic of what it was. Today, it is only to do with providing residential care. So in nearly every situation, with hardly any exception, with a few exceptions, whenever a social services authority places an adult in a care home, a registered care home, they will be doing that under the National Assistance Act 1948, Section 21. So why you need to know that? Because that would include any period. So I'm a frail elderly person. My wife is looking after me. She's going to go and stay with my daughter for the weekend because she needs some space. I can't be left on my own at the house. So I'm going to have to go into a residential care home funded by Herefordshire County Council. I live in Hereford, for the weekend. Well, then I'll be getting a weekend, 3 nights in a residential care home, so it's be 3 nights under the National Assistance Act. That's all. There's no such thing at law as a respite care or short break. It doesn't exist. It's what are you getting? Well, I'm getting 3 nights in a residential care home, so I'm getting 3 nights under the National Assistance Act. What's the point about that? Well, the point about that is that I'm getting it. I, the disabled person. My wife's not getting it. She's not getting her pillows fluffed. She's not in a care home. So respite care, well, it doesn't exist, but that service is a service given to me, the disabled person. It's not my wife's service. It's not a carer's service. She doesn't have to be there anyway, because we've abolished the liable family rule. So when we talk about short break, respite care, we're not talking about carer services. Those are disabled people's services. It's the disabled person being looked after in the care home, not the carer. So if I, as a lawyer, have got a client and they've been assessed as needing residential respite care, or we'll see community-based respite care, I'm going to want to look at the care plan for the disabled person. And once it's been decided it's needed, it's got to be provided, because that's what the Act says. And if the local authority says, well, we can't do that anymore, and I haven't magically improved, then we're going to have a bit of a tussle. So respite care is not a carer service. And if anybody's ever involved in the NHS continuing care, that's a very important point as well, because the NHS says they don't do carer services. That's another matter, but you can say, well, respite care is not a carer service, so we don't even have to have that conversation.
Can I just ask? question.
Yes, please, yeah.
So how do they, what sort of issues would be looked at to determine that the disabled person or the elderly person needed residential accommodation? If their care is normally adequately provided at home. So in that sort of situation we're talking about.
Well, I'll come on to that, because what we'll have to do is there'll have to be what's called an assessment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on disabled people's assessment, but I will spend longer on carers' assessments. The disabled person's assessment is what I call a what-if assessment. What if we don't do it? What will happen? That's all a community care assessment is. You just say, what if? What if we don't provide a weekend in the care home for Fred? What will happen? And if the answer is, he'll suffer serious harm, which we call critical and substantial, then the local authority's got to do it. If the answer is, no, he won't suffer significant harm, then the local authority doesn't, because they call it moderate or low. So you say, what will happen if we don't give Fred a weekend care? Well, you see, if Fred's on his own, and of course Fred's wife or sister or brother or mother or whatever doesn't have to be there because we've abolished the allowable family rule, then you've got to say, can he be on his own? Now, the answer is he can't be on his own. He needs 24/7 support or 24-hour support. Then, of course, the answer is, what are we going to do? We don't have to give him a care home. And that's the difference between a need and a service. His need is to be looked after in a safe, supported, and appropriate, dignified environment. You could do that in the house by putting in home care. You could take him to a day centre. You could put him in a care home. There are various, always different services to meet that need. But often with elderly people, it's going to be a care home, probably. So that it all depends on an assessment. And very often it's going to be a combined assessment of the carer's assessment and the disabled person's assessment. My book's sort of 1,200 pages long, and a lot of that is about the disabled person's assessment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it's basically just what if. What if we don't do this? What will happen? Now, people criticise the National Assistance Act. I'm very protective about the National Assistance Act, as you gather, but the National Assistance Act was slightly obsessed with residential care, and we have moved away from reliance on institutions. We have, in the last century, gone a long way to closing the big institutions, the residential institutions, the mental hospitals, the handicap hospitals. We have sort of created little institutions, but in significant measure, we have closed some of these big and pretty awful institutions. And we've moved away from that form of care to community-based care, trying to keep disabled people in their own homes. And so another act comes along in 1970 called the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, and it's a jewel of an act as well. It was an act passed by an MP called, it was written by an MP called Alf Morris, Lord Morris now. Well, he recently died, unfortunately. And the trouble with the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, it's a wonderful act, but it was written by somebody who isn't a lawyer. I've written a number of private members' bills, and they're all completely incomprehensible because I'm a lawyer, and we pride ourselves on writing things that you don't understand, because you then have to come and ask us what it means, and we charge you. But unfortunately, Alf wasn't a lawyer, so he wrote an act in very simple language. He basically said, when somebody needs something on this list, when a local authority is satisfied somebody needs something on that list, it's got to provide it. Full stop. Not subject to resources, it's got to provide it. And that's still true today. And the Law Commission, again, have criticised this act, which I love, and it will probably be codified next year. But it's a lovely list, because it shows what we've lost. Practical assistance in the home, wireless. It's not a Wi-Fi, it's a wireless. This is a nice list. These are a range of community-based services a local authority must provide if they've decided somebody needs it. I'm not going to go through these in detail, although I did a session last year with MenCap on this, and they criticised my presentation technique because it didn't have enough pictures. So this is sort of my revenge. Practical assistance to the home, what's that? Well, historically, that was ironing and hoovering, comrades. You know, it was a social care system. Shropshire County Council would have had an extensive home help service. And you would have got it. And you wouldn't only have got it, you would have got it without charge, because charging didn't exist until 10 years ago. Charging, which is really steep now, didn't exist. Far more people got these low-level services. Today the government goes on and on about proactive services, but we've never had fewer. We don't have home helps, we don't have Meals on Wheels much. It's a small relic of what it used to be. But practical assistance in the home could also be a sitting service. I'm sitting with Fred because his mother is at work or she's gone away. I'm paid by the local authority to sit with Fred because if he's at risk of harm if somebody isn't with him. I'm there because a night sitting service so that Fred, if he wakes up, doesn't come to harm. I'm there. I'm not sitting with the carer. A sitting service is for the disabled person. It's on the disabled person's assessment under the community care assessment because it's a service under the Chronically Disabled Persons Act. So again, respite care is a service to the disabled person, and once it's been decided, it's got to be done. Wireless library TV, that can be sort of braille books, it can be all sorts of supports, lectures, games, outings. I mean, in the old days, a lecture, game, outing, these are community-based activities. They would be the day centre. Now, of course, in the 80s and 90s, everybody said day centres are terrible things, blah, 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 blah. And some of them were not brilliant, but a lot of them weren't bad. A lot of my clients liked them. But now they're told they're not allowed to do that because it's dogmatically a bad thing. They've got to now go paragliding during the day instead because it's called personalisation. And, you know, I've been at meetings where ministers have said that. And you really ask about their medication. You know, this is absurd, but this is what we're being told. Most of the day centres have gone. You know, some of them weren't great, but if you decide I need to go to a day centre, how am I going to get there? You know, do I have wings? Do I have a helicopter? No, I don't. Oh, but your family can do it. Well, your family don't necessarily have to do that because we've abolished the liable family rule. Oh, but you get mobility component. Well, I get mobility component, yes I do, but not to pay for the taxi once a week. I get it because I have a wheelchair or I need all sorts of things in the week. I don't get mobility component just to hand it over to the local authority. I was doing this with MenCap and we were doing a talk in I won't name the authority, we'll just call it Oldham. And they just said because of the cutbacks they don't do transport anymore. I thought, wow, I thought parliamentary laws extended even into Oldham. But, people forget that a lot of these things are underpinned by law. Holidays. I mean, in the old days, most urban authorities would have had modest little sort of chalets around the coast like this where people would go and spend a weekend. They did, you got a holiday. You don't do that anymore. They've gone. All those, Hackney chalets in Bognor Regis have gone. These are things we've lost because what we've forgotten is social care has been cut and cut and cut. A lot of the quality is good, and a lot of disabled people are getting very good services, but it is the neglected area. And then we get meals and telephones. Meals and telephones are very interesting. I go on about those. I mean, meals are quite an interesting issue because No, I'm not going to go there. Sorry. This is nothing to do with carers really, but we've abolished institutionalisation. So we say. I think we've just abolished the big institutions. We've got now mini institutions, Winterbournes and Southern Cross and things like that. But we're also we're institutionalising disabled people by the way we respond to their needs. You don't need, if you're an elderly person, to be helped cook, to buy food, to go to the supermarket. We'll just give you something you can heat up. So you don't socialise. We don't take you to the cinema. You can sit in front of your computer. We don't let you go to the shop because you can buy it online. We're sort of creating institutionalisation within people's homes. They're just stuck there looking at their computer. And they can buy food, they can see films, they can eat. But, that in a way meets the needs. But that's a form of institutionalisation that, I'd almost rather be in a ward with 15 other people than that. Anyway, you only get these services if the local authority is satisfied you need it. Often the local authority may not be satisfied you need a home help because they'll say, what if you don't have it? And if the answer isn't, I'll suffer significant harm, then you won't get it. Local authorities can't say, we don't do home helps anymore. Here's a list of age concern. I mean, local authorities all do that these days, but in fact they can't say we don't do home helps anymore because Parliament said once they're satisfied something's necessary, they've got to do it. And that could include a home help. But generally those sort of services don't hit the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria, as I say, are the question, if you ask the question, what if we don't do this? Unless the answer is significant harm, then they're going to say, well, it's not sufficiently high on our criteria for us to respond to that. So we then come to the what-if game. We've got to make sure the local authority, assessor, because assessments are done by social services. Parliament said it's their job, and they decide what we need. We don't decide, they decide. And so we need somebody to come along and assess us. And we've got to convince that person that if they don't give us what we want, we'll suffer significant harm, or the person for whom we care will suffer significant harm. So that person who comes along has got to get all the relevant data because she or he is going to have to work out what the consequences are if services aren't provided. So the first stage of an assessment is gathering data. And we need a skilled assessor, and they've got to come and see us. Now, local authorities are, I don't know if it's happening around here, but it will, sooner or later, playing with things called self-assessment questionnaires. My clients, if they get a self-assessment questionnaire through the post, they have warnings, they must not touch it without gloves on, but if they have gloves, they can then put it in the bin. My clients are just simply not filling those out. I'm sure Shropshire isn't doing that. In Shropshire, they go into the Arga, probably. You can't do that. You cannot do that. But it's happening. The government go on and on and on about the fact that 13% of the whole social services budget, £3 billion, is spent on assessments. What a waste. Well, I don't think so. I think that I want skilled professionals coming into people's houses, sitting with them and talking about their situation. I don't want to sort of do this over the computer, thank you very much, or with tick boxes. I want skilled professionals coming in, seeing what it's like, to see somebody try and get dressed or bath themselves, or to see those situations. And I do want to spend £3 billion. And that, by the way, is a very interesting fact. I told you, £110 billion is spent every year on the NHS. If you do your maths, you can work out what's spent on social care. The NHS spends £110 billion. Social care, £13 billion. It's tiny. It's a tiny sum of money. We talk about we can't afford to pay for social care. We have all sorts of royal commissions. But in fact, social care is actually a very small sum of money. All we're looking around for to give free social care is £2 billion. To radically improve it is £4 billion. You know, that's not even, 9 months in Iraq. It's 2 aircraft carriers. You know, the amount of money we need in social care is actually very small. But the one thing I do want in social care is I do want skilled professionals. I don't want people that used to work in a call centre and now, have been wheeled in to do some reassessment. I want skilled, well-paid social workers to go in and sit with my clients and assess. 70% of all the information you take in is visual. You've got to be there. And it's not just visual, you've got to smell the place and hear the place and see the place. And, sorry.
My husband is in hospital at the moment and he's broken his hip, he's 86. And he's going to be assessed by social services. But I've been told they can go and question him in the hospital without me attending. And he hasn't a clue of what he's doing at home. Can I be there? Can I get in touch with social services and be there when he's interviewed?
Well, of course you could be there, yes. Unless they've got some security guards, they're going to have problems stopping you sitting on his bed, aren't they? So, I mean, most law is just common sense, Yeah, I mean, this is silly, isn't it?
But if they did this assessment and she wasn't there, would she have a referral?
Yes, I mean, if you've got to write in and say, I mean, there's so many people are desperate to get out of hospital, they'll say that they have, 14 children.
Everything's fine at home.
Everything's perfect, yeah. I have written so many letters saying, look, this person is not coming home. And it can be very difficult in that situation because, of course, as soon as they know there's a carer, they're out the door because that accelerates. But they don't just sort of calm down and say, how's this going to impact on you? We'll come back to that because it's a key issue in the carer's assessment. So you've got to insist that. And he cannot be discharged until you've had a carer's assessment.
I've had one a few months back.
No, now.
Oh, now.
Yeah. Sorry.
After 12 months of trying to get social services to help me care for my father, he was eventually admitted to hospital because he collapsed.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a privately paid carer that I was paying for was there the day he collapsed. A week later, a social worker told me my father's got dementia. He was in hospital and they had been and spoken to him that he was coming home.
Yeah.
I turned around and said, no, he isn't until I get some help.
Yeah.
Because my father lives with me, I do not live with my father, and unless I get some help, he's not coming home. And they had to change their attitude. But if you need help at home, it's very distressing to sit at the bottom of the bed with somebody you love and have to say that you're not prepared to take them home when they're desperate to come home. And I'm afraid sometimes that's what you need to do.
Yeah. And then I mean, my heart is with social services, it really is. They are so short of money, it's crazy. And they're doing all sorts of naughty things, but they're doing it because they have no money. The NHS, for all its belly aching, is a well-funded service. It is putting huge pressure on social services to discharge us, and the nurses are saying, "Oh, your daughter doesn't want you home," and there's all that because they're just trying to get, and they actually haven't got a lot of beds because they've got rid of it. But a bed is £1,000 a day in a general hospital, and people will stay in that even though social services just lack the money to do these sort of things. But you just got to just say, you know, I've written many letters from people like yourself. We're using some precedent letters. I'm doing some work, putting on the internet. But that's one I should put up. It's just saying, you know, he is not coming home. You know, get it. It is not happening. And often they say, oh, but it's his home. He owns half of it. You know, how can you exclude it from your home? And you have to write back and say, look, which bit of it don't you understand? He's not coming home. You know, it's a huge issue. Because you know you're traumatised at that side. You need support, and you need to hear that people have done it and it's been okay. But it's largely standing up to some fairly, sometimes some not very pleasant attitudes from the NHS. You know, people are dying for this bed, you know, and you're killing them, basically. And, you know, that sort of stuff is...
If you get this service, somebody else won't.
Yes, this is right, this is right. Well, you know, we're going to have to get thick skins, aren't we? So, we're going to gather the data. So the social worker comes, they see me, they gather the data, and then they go back to their deep-piled, carpeted offices. They open a bottle of wine, they light their pipe, and she then decides what I need. And that's what it should be. It should be her or him using their professional judgment from their years of training and experience to say, what is it Fred needs? What will happen if we don't help Fred? And then they mull over it, have another glass of port or whatever, and then they write down what Fred needs. That's how it should happen. These are professionals. They're just the same as doctors or lawyers or teachers. They should make those decisions. And then, having decided that Fred needs this, that, and the other, then they have to construct a care plan, which is the other side of the equation. Fred needs looking after between 9 and 5 on weekdays. The way we're going to do that is we put in home help, or we'll go to a day centre, or we'll go paragliding, or what have you. So a care plan is just the sort of specification that meets the need. About 1990 something, in the second half of the 20th century, this government, the governments from sort of mid-70s onwards have been what I would call neoliberal. They believe in just letting the free marketplace run wild. They believe in free markets, they believe in free everything. Free in the sense of without state controls. Particularly banks. And they also believe in what we call commodification and privatisation. They believe that the state shouldn't be doing these things, that it should be done by private entities. So initially, they start saying the state may make these resource decisions, but it's got to be provided privately, not by the local authority home help service, but by an independent home help service. It's not by a local authority care home, but by an independent care home. So we privatise provision. But ideally, the state wouldn't be in the what one of my colleagues, somebody called, she's Professor Julia Twigg, she's written some fantastic stuff about carers, she's at Kent. She calls dirty business. She says caring is the dirty business. That's what the state doesn't want to be involved in, the dirty business. And so instead of actually commissioning care, you give people money instead. You what's called commodify it. You say, look, Fred doesn't need this, this, and this. Fred needs 58 quid. Here's 58 quid, sort it out. And so in the mid-90s, we bring in things called direct payments. And direct payments have been great for quite a small number of people, but for them it's been fantastic. But even after 15 years of direct payments, we still only have about 7% of the population getting them, of people that get support. 93% of social care is still paid the traditional way, by paying for these services. So the government, the last government, and this present government's just as keen on it, came up with a brilliant idea called personal budgets. The last government said, and this government said until recently, they wanted everybody to have a personal budget by April next year. They've just said that, in fact, they only want 70% now because it's such a crazy target. But everybody, the new bill that's coming through says everybody will have a personal budget. So the question is, I mean, have you heard of personal budgets here or not?
No.
You have? Oh, gosh. It's a bit like the plague. I didn't know if it reached the western part. Does anybody know what the difference is between a personal budget and a direct payment? I'm going to be talking to social workers after lunch, and I imagine their response will be pretty much the same too. What's the difference between a personal budget and... because most people will be being told they've got a personal budget. Well, the big difference is direct payments exist in law. Personal budgets don't have any, in social care, any existence at all. They're fluffy little clouds of ideas. So that's the big difference.
Can I just mention universal credit at this stage?
This was getting bleak enough.
Only Shropshire volunteered to trial universal
Oh, did
credit.
it? Right.
And my son, who's got Asperger's syndrome, was
Yeah.
picked as one of the guinea pigs
Great.
to receive payment direct. People with Asperger's syndrome cannot manage money.
No.
And I had to get in touch with the housing benefits team to stop them paying him the money and continue. Otherwise, he would have got into arrears and been evicted from where he lives. That's just going to be so much trouble next year.
It is going to be a huge problem because the thing about direct payments, although they can be empowering for some disabled people, they involve transferring risk from the state to the individual. Because the state, instead of having to sort things out and if things go wrong, the individual has to do that. Well, that's fair enough if you've got a PhD and you're a wheelchair user, as some of my friends are. They've got those skills. But of course, what we're doing, because at least a third of community care service users don't have capacity to make fairly basic decisions, we're not transferring risk from the state to the individual. We're transferring the state. We're recreating the liable family rule by this process. We're placing those obligations increasingly on family members. And we'll see that this is, I mean, I haven't got time to go into this, but what will happen with the new system is charging is going to be really ramped up. But you're going to be able to charge under the new Act for anything. All carers will have to pay charges for what they go. But you'll also have to pay for your assessment. Social work is going to become chargeable. Advocacy is going to become chargeable. And so we'll give you the money, but if you say I'm not prepared to do it, they'll give your son they'll give it to a broker, and of course that money will then have to be used for the broker as well as. So they'll say, well, he's much worse off because you're not prepared to manage it.
We run an emotional support service for parent carers of children with disabilities or additional need up to 25. And we've been invited recently to go along to a marketplace event where we can promote our services to parent carers who might want to, through via personalisation, because for parent carers the option of personalised budgets is what they're looking to bring in next year. And I have real concerns about doing that because I can't see any parent carers spending money on buying emotional support for themselves. Because their priorities in this case are going to be elsewhere. I think it's a really dangerous path to tread down.
It's very difficult. Once you start giving people money without, then one of the interesting things is they say that promotes choice. Well, if people got money, sometimes they use choice not to buy the service because it's so expensive. I don't want to spend that. You know, we're not going there. So the difference between a personal budget and direct payment is simple. In law, if money leaves Herefordshire Council and goes into the coffers of the bank account of the disabled person or their mother or somebody on their behalf, that's a direct payment. Money's actually leaving the local authority. And that's law. It's the disabled person's got to agree to that, or somebody on their behalf's got to agree to it. And it's subject to all sorts of rules and regulations.
The direct payments, I live with my father. Because direct payments, like I never had hardly any holidays at all, rest
Yeah.
in the 5 years that I looked after him 24/7. But the direct payment couldn't be paid to me. It had to go out to somebody to come in to look after Father
Yes.
while I was away.
Yeah.
And sometimes we feel that we don't want to leave
Yeah.
our parents with somebody that they don't know, especially with
Yeah,
dementia,
yeah.
when they get frustrated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, the law was changed in 2002 to say that direct payments could be spent on family carers.
well, when I went for it, they refused me.
Okay.
The contract says it can't be. We have raised that.
Well, they can't trump the law with local policies. The law says there's no restriction on paying a direct payment to family members as long as but there is if the family member lives in the same household. If you live in the same household, if you don't live in the same household, there's no restriction at all.
No, it's not.
But if you live in the same household, then the local authority can do it if it's satisfied it's necessary. And increasingly, I think local authority, I think Shropshire, and nearly every authority, and Shropshire's a big-ish authority, will be sometimes allowing people to have direct payments to pay family members in their own household.
You have to make an exception in circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem because the local authority says it's exceptional and the law actually isn't phrased in that phrase. All the law says it's got to be considered necessary.
The standard contract that comes out says,
Right.
specifically says you can't, and I've not signed my contract.
Yeah, well, the whole point about standard forms, if you're a lawyer, is to just put lines through them.
I said no.
Just put red lines through them and just say, yeah, and then initial it and say, I agree everything. Oh, by the way, I crossed out all those 14 clauses on page 6 because I don't agree with them. You're allowed to do that. Just sort of, just treat forms with disrespect. And if they have a little white box, there used to be a lovely thing that if they had a white box saying, don't write in this because this is for official purposes, what you do is you get a candle and you put it on that. So you make they can't write in it either, So, yeah, be anarchic with forms. So they've got a standard form and just say, we agree this, but not that, and send it back. And they'll often say, fine. A direct payment is when money leaves the local authority and goes into somebody's account. A personal budget doesn't actually leave the local authority, although they try to call everything a personal budget. Because personal budgets don't exist, legally a direct payment is money going out. A personal budget is something else. A personal budget is where the local authority holds on to the money, but it tries to... There are two ways. I'll explain how this works. There are two ways you can calculate a personal budget. Now, I'm going to give you a completely neutral explanation of this. I'm going to call one of them the good way. Now, there's 166 social services authorities in England. 10 of them are doing it this way, and I think it's a good way. I'm Fred. I've got learning disabilities, moderate learning disabilities. I live on my own in supported housing. In fact, my sister lives around the corner and she does an awful lot for me, but I don't really realise that. And the local authority come and see me and said, look, Fred, we'd love to give you a direct payment, but you don't have the ability to consent to that and your sister doesn't want one, so we can't do that. So we're going to give you a personal budget. Okay. Now, we've worked out that you have 2 days care home, day centre a week, and you have 4 hours home help a week, and we drive you to and from the day centre. And we've worked out that that is costing us £142 a week. Us, Herefordshire Council. So you've got a personal budget of £142. How would you like us to spend it in a way that maximised your happiness and well-being? Well-being's a big word. It's almost 2. I mean, you go to a day centre twice a week. Now, do you really want to go to a day centre twice a week? I mean, have you considered options? I don't know, paragliding. And so you try and involve the disabled person in the assessment. Now, that seems to me a brilliant idea. The sort of evangelical people about personalisation call it self-directed support, SDS, as if it's never been thought of before. But many of us will remember that 10 years ago we had a thing called person-centred planning, and 25 years ago we had a thing called individually tailored packages of care. It's not new, but it's a good idea. So that, brothers and sisters, is the good way. The other 156 social services authorities are not doing it that way. What they're doing is they're giving you one of these self-assessment questionnaires with just tick boxes. What happens is they're 20-page forms or something like that, and you just tick. These are the things, this is all the help I need during the day, this is what I need at night, this is what I need at other places. And you fill out and you just tick boxes. And the first one might say, I need a lot of help getting up, washing, dressing. I need quite a lot of help. I need a reasonable amount of help. I don't need a lot of help. I need no help. So it's sort of, but then at the bottom it says, but I get all the help I need from my carer. I get some of the help. I get a little help. I get no help from my carer. And each page goes on like that, and you tick it. The local authority then feed that form, because it's got no white boxes really, generally, into what's called a resource allocation system. Has anybody heard of a RAS? Okay. They feed it into a machine, which is called a RAS, and it just scores all the ticks. If you tick this, you might get 10 points, and if you tick that, you might get 5 points. So you might say, I need a lot of help during the day, so that tick might give you 15 points. But at the bottom, you might say, but I get a lot of help from my carer, so you then lose 75% of that point, because it's called a carer deflator. So basically, this goes into a computer which reads the assessment, which this person with moderately advanced learning disability or Alzheimer's disease has just filled out. It then is an algorithm, it scores it and says, Fred is got 200 points. Okay, so we've never seen Fred, we've never been there, he's filled this form out, he's told us what care he's getting, he's told us what he needs, and we've said Fred's got 200 points. We've then got to work out what a point is worth in Hereford or Shropshire. The point is what it costs to buy care. So a point will be less in Hereford than Shropshire, because Shropshire's richer than Hereford. We're the country bumpkins, apples and chickens is all we do. But a point will be much more expensive in Kensington and Chelsea, because care is very expensive to buy there. So it'll vary. So each authority has to do its own assessment system, and it has to assign a value to a point. So let's say Hereford says a point's worth 50p. Then they have to reduce it. Even though you've sort of scientifically worked out what the care market is, you then reduce it by what's called a cost abatement multiplier. And that's between 15 and 35%. Why do you reduce a figure that you worked out scientifically? The government says you do it to avoid inducing dependency. I've written a lot about this, and you just will need to be drinking when you read that article. I mean, what's that about? And then you get a figure. So you might then say to Fred, well, a point's worth 40p, and you've got 200 points. So the machine says your indicative amount, your personal budget, is £80. And Fred's sister says, yeah, but you're saying Fred's got a personal budget of £80, but he's actually getting £142 worth of services. And the social worker says, yeah, it's a serious problem. I mean, Fred is getting a lot more than he should be getting. A lot of people are losing out because of Fred. I mean, we've actually had to take 3 disabled children out this week and slaughter them because we just don't have enough money to balance our budget. And I'm not saying that conversation, but this conversation is happening up and down the country. These computers that have never seen Fred, that have been, programmed by geeks, basically, are then coming out with figures that are substantially below what it costs. And that's being used for some discussion. Now, everybody will have to have a personal budget, but my clients are not interested in their personal budget. That too is going in the bin. They're going to say, I'm interested in you meeting need. And the courts have said, these things don't exist in law. the local authorities have got to meet need. But personal budgets are causing a lot of distress for families and carers because they're often, I mean, I've just done a very big paper on it. It'll be on my website. It's called Putting the Cart Before the Horse. We've analysed a very large number of these. It's quite a technical paper. But these are always now coming well within. And if you've got learning disabilities or some I mean, most RASs are based on the cost of providing for older people. And of course, that's quite cheap compared to providing for people with mental health problems or learning disabilities or particularly sensory impairments. So they're coming out well below what people are getting.
Can I just ask how this applies to post-18? Because obviously personal budgets are going to be promoted very much for now for young people.
And education and all sorts of things, yeah.
So how does the liable family, does that come...
Well, the liable family rule doesn't apply. Well, I mean, I'm not really going to have much time to go into disabled children. We don't, I mean, with children, there isn't, I mean, parents have responsibilities, which start off as total when the child is born, but by the age of, I don't know, this is the Gillett case, basically. You know, in my daughter's case, it was about 11. They tell you to, you know, go away, and, you know, all you can do is give them a bit of advice, which they ignore, you know. So it's a withering right. Of course, it's not against the law to say, I can't cope, take my kid. You're not sent to prison for that. The local authority has a duty to safeguard and promote the interests of children in need. And the guidance on carers, which I'm going to come on to now, is good on that. It's just saying parents of, it says carers, including parents of disabled children, have a right to work like everybody else. They have a right to a normal life like everybody else. They have a right because they gain emotionally and socially as well as financially. So, you know, it is more difficult discussion with the social services if you've got a disabled child.
But doing a personalisation project and they're doing exactly what you...
Yeah. Well, with personalisation, we're not going to be playing that game. It's not in law. It doesn't exist in law, and the law is that they've got to meet need. And a thing like the Chronic Sick and Disabled Persons Act, that's an act that applies to disabled children as to adults. It's from cradle to grave. So those rights exist, but there is more difficulty in the sense that you can't say we don't assume willingness to provide, but we shouldn't put unreasonable care and responsibilities. Sorry.
What I was wondering is, so they do use the questionnaire in this county and the RAS as well. So if somebody is assessed in that way, you know, you're saying put it in the bin, put it away.
Well, I mean, you need a lawyer to tell you that, but...
Yes, right, but practically speaking, if a person does that, you know, probably they won't give a service.
Well, the Ombudsman said an assessment should, from beginning to end, should be no more than 6 weeks.
Right.
And the courts have repeatedly said I mean, there's a case against Cornwall saying self-assessment's unlawful. You can only do it if you agree to it. You know, if you want to self-assess yourself, you can. So what you're saying is, look, I've got this form, I want a social worker here with me to do that. Now, the social worker will come and fill the form out, but you will staple to it 26 letters from your cousins, uncles, aunts, your priest, your neighbour, saying, if Fred doesn't get this, he'll suffer significant harm. So those forms will be used, but we need a social worker there. Sorry, I interrupted.
So what I was thinking was, if that does go ahead, they do the service.
Yeah.
Normally, most people don't realise.
No, they don't.
Think,
No,
I
no.
have to do this. I better do what.
Yeah, sure. And most social workers think it's law. They're not being naughty.
If then the package comes out exactly as you say, half of what
Yeah.
they're getting now, and then they say, hang on a second, I don't agree with this. Can they then say, listen, I want you to come and do social
Yeah.
I don't agree with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would be perfectly fine to do.
Yeah. And the local authority, when they say what your budget is, they will, it may not be immediately obvious, but they will be telling you that it's only indicative.
Yes.
But often they tell you that if you don't agree that, you may get less. You know, there's all sorts of things that are going with those things. We've done quite a lot of research on that. I'm sure it's not Shropshire. I mean, the worst ones are London and the home counties. Shropshire's Paragon. But yes, you know, this is the problem, that even social workers don't have a lot of training on social care law. So they think this is part of the legal system. They're not being dishonest. And there's it's very difficult for families to complain because they're very fearful of losing what they've got sometimes. And it's all unwritten and unsaid, and they're all good people, but that's what's happening. And then people are being led to believe that we don't do community care anymore or children's assessments anymore, we do personal budgets. This is the new game. And hardly anybody knows there's no law there. It's just a fashion.
Yeah.
And it's not working. I mean, these systems, the whole thing, the local authorities have spent a fortune on these systems, and they're not going to work. They're all going to be binned in 3 years' time. But it's causing huge upset to families who are being given a figure that bears little resemblance to the package they're getting at the moment.
Can I just
Yes.
clarify? My understanding within Shropshire Council is that it starts with a self-assessment,
Yeah,
and then there will be a professional visit, and
Right.
then the social worker will do their assessment, and there's a middle row where they agree. Because what we found was that, as you said yourselves, that sometimes the service user, the person who needs understanding of their situation, is very different than perhaps the professionals will be. So my understanding is in Shropshire, the common practice is that they actually get both, and you agree a little line, and that's what comes out with the figure. Though that's the actual assessment. My understanding of the RAS is as you've explained. So
I mean, our research shows that the RASs are being, most local authorities that have invested heavily in them are now realising they're actually not working, and so they're beginning to abandon them. But the huge cost.
My daughter's just turned 18, so she's gone through all these assessments.
Yeah.
They're all geared up for having a personal budget, but then she's got complex health needs as well,
Mhm,
so she
mhm.
had a continuing healthcare assessment, and she's actually got a continuing
Right,
healthcare
right.
package. So we've got by the time of personal budgets. But what we were told by health is that they only have to meet her clinical needs, which in a way made me kind of feel cheated.
How old is she?
18.
There's a word that rhymes with Rolex.
I thought as much, but I just wanted clarification. Because we sort of thought, well, if we'd had a personal budget, we could have bought whatever we felt she needed.
Yeah.
But now that we haven't, because health don't do personal budgets.
Well, health can do personal budgets. They can't do direct payments, so that's a big problem, but they can do personal budgets, and they should do personal budgets. They will be very criticised. And once you're continuing healthcare, all your health and social care needs fall. Now, the trouble is the NHI are very difficult. I mean, they are very difficult on this, and you're going to need somebody to hold your hand on that one and just say, look, I'm sorry. This is it. And the way often with the NHS is to go to your MP or to go to a councillor or to go to the newspaper. I mean, we don't say to the, Hereford primary care trusts, I mean, they're all going to go anyway, so they're very shortly. We don't say we're going to sue you, which is what we say to local authorities because we're friendly. With the NHS, you say, this is unlawful, and we've got Midlands Today coming down. What time would you like us to film you? That's what they don't like. They don't like that. But, that's nonsense. Once you're continuing care, it's like you move from Shropshire to Hereford. It's the new authority's got all the same responsibilities. They've got to meet all the health and social care needs. This idea that they've only got clinical responsibilities is nonsense. But they'll look you in the face and say, they might look you in the face and say no. And so you've got to have somebody that will support you in that. And it's under a thing called the NHS Continuing Care Framework Guidance 2009. Yesterday a new one came out, which will come into force in April, but it's much the same. So.
My son's 20 and I had the same problem.
Uh-huh.
And I threatened to go to the papers and they gave me everything I wanted.
That's just so good. What we're going to do is I'm doing some research with a big children's charity, and we're going to do information and standard letters, but we're also going to do YouTubes about people who just say brief things like that. I was told this, because so many people are told that, and they think they're the only. You might think you were the only one, but in fact you're not the only one. And then you need somebody like yourself to stand up and say, "Look, I was told this. This is what I said," and suddenly I got it.
We shouldn't have to blackmail them, they should agree all the time.
No.
That's what we do.
You have to fight, yeah, unfortunately.
The National Assistance Act that underpins social care.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that that's going to be gotten rid of?
Yeah, it's going to be got.
Yeah. When?
There's a care and support bill going through Parliament, a draft care and support bill at the moment. That new act, if it comes into force, won't come into force until at the earliest April 2015. But obviously we're working very hot on that. It's a very technical paper and we're working on it. And the useful thing is that 2015 is likely to be an election year. And the government doesn't want this to go wrong. But yes, it is going to be repealed. It is 65 years old. It could do with codifying, but they've got to do it in a proper way.
Would that get rid of what's now termed as the duty of care?
No.
No. The councils would still have
Yeah.
the duty of care.
Yeah. Everything will be all right. This is the darkest period. It's going to get better. Everything's going to get better. I mean, we might have to live through the welfare reforms next year, which will be awful if you're on benefits. But after that, we as a British people, English people, will start electing sensible governments.
Where are they? Who's going to rock
I don't know. They don't exist yet. They don't exist yet, but it will be all right. It will be all right. Somebody will come along. And it will be all right. So what is interesting is that we have we sort of in the mid-70s we're in a similar dark period because things weren't very good in the 70s either actually. But when I was a solicitor in the 70s and I thought the welfare state, that sort of welfare state, would carry on forever. But it didn't. It suddenly changed. A lot of people think that the settlement we have at the moment, with everything being privatised and everything being cut, will carry on forever. But I think we're about to have... I think these things go in 30-year cycles. We've had 30 years of neoliberalism. It hasn't really made us better off. We are bust. There are hugely rich people, and the majority of the population are not in a very good way. Things don't look very good. It's not a system that you think, you say, oh, isn't this great? Hasn't it done really well? I think things will change. I mean, the reason I think it changed so radically at the end of the 70s was, we elected Voldemort, basically. And boom, we had this hugely strong individual that did these things. We don't have that. But something will happen because I think as a population, this system isn't working, and the group it really isn't working for are carers, not disabled elderly or people, curiously. It's carers that's taking that strain, and they are stretched because a lot of them are having to work as well, or trying to work, and they're not, they're going to be very poor. So in the mid-70s, when we start pulling away the welfare state and we're going to what's called residualism, then we start seeing rhetorical expressions of concern about carers. We start getting legislation, and this is sort of some of it, which comes along, carers this, carers that, carers the others. Carers get lots of mentions. And they get mentions because I think neoliberal states realise that they've got to say a honeyed word about carers because they know that they are beginning as a group to be under this double whammy. They're being pushed into work, but they're also being forced to provide more care. And of course, people are living care longer, so many of us are caring. My wife and I are caring for our elderly parents, and we've got 5 grandchildren, and their mums are in work, we all know those sort of situations, and we're paying for their mortgages. Don't get me going. That's becoming quite a big issue, I think. It's not working for carers. So we get this spate of legislation. Now, I actually drafted that bill, and I was very involved in the drafting of this bill. And I'm not knocking them, but these are pretty cheap measures. What carers need is they need a carer's allowance that is hundreds of pounds, not 60 odd quid. They need really good welfare benefits, and they need proper pension entitlements, and that's going to cost billions and billions. And what we're getting instead is fairly palliative responses. They're not. I'm not knocking them, but radically, something much more than that's got to happen. So, just quickly running through these, the main act is that act, the Carers Recognition and Services Act. It comes along in 1995. because we're getting this privatisation of care, we're getting assessments, but carers are being left out of assessments. So Carers National Association, it's now called Carers UK, got me to draft a bill for them in 1993. They then look around to find an MP who will put his name in the ballot for the private members bill. And Malcolm Wicks did it in 1994, November. Malcolm came high enough in the members bill to introduce his bill into Parliament. It was actually quite a nice period. I've dealt with all the governments since John Major's time onwards, and John Major's time, they were the nicest government to deal with. I mean, my heart isn't, I don't vote for that group, but they were a nice government. They were doomed, they all knew they were doomed. They all knew they were going to lose. And so they would just give you anything you wanted, basically. They were the most, and there was somebody, Virginia Bottomley, really nice. She helped this thing through. God, I love them. So we got this. Now, this is sort of quite poignant. That's Malcolm. He is an incredibly nice man. Malcolm died 3 months ago. His by-election was yesterday, his Croydon North. Incredibly lovely man. But it became law. And it didn't do a lot. But I think it just said that when you're doing an assessment, you've got to consider the carers. When you're discharging somebody from hospital, think, carer. So what it says is that when a disabled person is being assessed, and somebody in hospital and we argue very strongly that this would be a disabled person of any age, so it covers disabled children as well as adults. So when there is somebody who is having one of these assessments, a community care assessment or a children assessment or a review, and there's a carer providing substantial amount of care, then you've got to ask them, they're not employed, you've got to ask them, and then you assess the sustainability of the caring relationship. I should say that the new legislation, when it comes forward, which is being drafted, will do away with the need for a substantial carer. It'll be any carer, and it'll do away with the request, both of which are not really relevant anymore anyway. So the government's saying that the new legislation will be good for carers, and in some respects it will be. So how does this work? Well, all you get in this is an assessment. So we've assessed Albert. He's 80, he's got dementia, he lives on his own. His daughter pops in a couple of times a week, but she works. So she can't do much more than she's doing. And that's been okay, but now she's worried because he's becoming very much more neglectful and forgetful. He's not dressing himself properly, he's not bathing himself properly, he's not eating properly, he's wandering. So she asks us to social services to go in. We assess Albert, we work out that he probably needs 24/7 care. We might arrange for sort of a stair lift and sitting service and day centres, that sort of stuff. So he'd get quite a good package. What happens if Albert lives with his wife, but he's got exactly the same needs? How would that work? Well, we would have to offer her a community care assessment. A Carers Act assessment. And the law says you look at 3 key areas. You look at autonomy. Now, autonomy just means choice in this context. Because, of course, carers must be told they don't have to do it, because we've abolished the liable family rule on the 5th of July 1948. So you've got to say to the wife, in this case, or the daughter, you don't have to do this, but are you willing and able to do anything? And that should be put in a neutral way. Do you have a choice over what you do? A lot of carers are providing 24/7. They have no feeling of choice. You then have to ask them, is the caring having an adverse impact on your health and well-being? 56% of all carers have a caring-related health condition. There's 6.5 million carers in the UK, so over 3.5 million of them are suffering ill health because of their caring. Now that may be a back injury or a lifting injury, but most commonly it's acute stress, anxiety or depression. Half of that group, so over 1.5 million carers, have been to see their GP about their caring-related health condition. So caring is not good for you, and it's actually putting a huge strain on the NHS. So we have to discuss that. And finally, there's what impact is caring having on your other roles? Now, particularly this is going to be work, education, training, but other social activities. Now, I've just said, if Albert was living on his own, we might give him that sort of care package. We might say he needs getting up, feeding, dressing, he needs, so we'd put in home help, Meals on Wheels, sitting service, day centre. That would all be under the Chronic Sickness and Disabled Persons Act, sorry.
So, that's what you were saying before about carers having a choice when they're... My father, I've been looking after him for 4.5 years. And I had a neck operation, my spine operation that went from the phone. He was only in respite for 5 weeks, and then you couldn't afford it anymore for him to be looked after, supporting him. And I've had a big breakdown. I had no choice, and my father was taken into a home by social services. And when I was very vulnerable, when I was spoken to, I had nobody with me. And then they took him from me and they put him in a home, and which made me very ill. So what choice do I have in life? And now I found out that I have to leave my father's home, and they won't even let him come home at weekends.
Right.
That, to me, has been taken out of my hands as a carer, and I know that's happened to many, many people.
I mean, one of the things that I'm going to come on to briefly in a minute is the fact that you needed support, you needed advocacy, you needed information, you needed to know what his and your rights were. Because this is all very well, but it's law, it's complicated. You don't, unless you've come across somebody who can support you emotionally and with information, it's not much use to you. And of course now, and it wasn't when that happened. So, the one thing I think we have seen is a considerable growth in carers organisations, and like today is witness to that. So hopefully,
I've come today to more or less say this has got to stop. Because it's going to keep happening and happening.
Well, you're a classic example of the fact that you can't take any more. You're stretched as much as you could possibly go, it seems to me, and we need, I think increasingly people have got to realise that you're not unique, if you see what I mean, that there'll be many people here who are in that similar situation. And one of the things we're trying to do with these YouTube things is because very often disabled people, elderly people, carers think they're the only person this has happened to. And they come to me and you think, oh, not again, or like the hospital discharge or the transition into adulthood, these problems. But the more you articulate it, I think more politically powerful your message becomes. Things have got to change. So if Fred was living on his own, or your elderly father was living on his own, that might have happened. But if Fred was living with his carer, the local authority said he doesn't need home help, he doesn't need meals, he doesn't need sitting services, because when we ask the what if question, what if we don't feed Fred, the answer is, well, he won't suffer harm because his wife does it or his daughter does it. So he doesn't need it. So you often end up with the carer doing everything and the local authority doing nothing. And that's called the inverse carer law, that the carers that provide the most help get the least support from local authorities. They're the 24/7 carers. But we can't make that decision that she does everything, his wife does everything, and the local authority does nothing, without offering her a carer's assessment. And in that carer's assessment, we'd look at autonomy, health involvement, and health and safety. And I had a case, 15 years ago, like this. Sorry.
Excuse me. I'm a carer for my wife, and I've been assessed. But my daughter helps me at various times. Is she entitled to an assessment?
Yes, she would be. Yeah, you can have many assessments, yeah.
Thank you.
Is that all right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The local authority normally be quite happy to do carers assessments because they've got a target, and hopefully that would be, the more the merrier. I had a case a bit like this about 15 years ago. Elderly woman caring for her elderly husband. He was needing 24/7. He was really needed a lot of support. His review is that needs to continue. She's offered a care assessment. She has a care assessment. Autonomy. Do you choose to do this? And she was sort of said, yeah, of course I choose to. We've been married nearly 50 years, Of course I choose to do this. It's almost insulting in a way. She's saying, yeah, obviously I'd like to get away and see my daughter and my grandchildren a bit, but I do choose to do this. On involvement, she was saying, well, I'm not working. I don't get out at all socially, but, I'd like to go shopping and things like that. But no, I think it's my duty in a sort of, a very decent way to do this. That's what we do, for better or for worse. And most people would say that, probably. But when it came to health and safety, she paused a long time. And she said, look, that's a huge problem. I've been worrying about this now for 3 months. Because 3 months ago, my doctor told me she thought I'd had a slight stroke. And she told me that if I don't stop this enormous amount of caring, I'm probably going to have a major stroke and I'm going to end up as disabled as my husband. And she had read the Riot Act, basically, and said, you've got to consider putting your husband into a care home, because if you don't do that, it's going to kill you. And she said, look, I am never, ever going to agree to him going in a care home. It will just, I would never agree to that. And so she'd lived for 3 months or so with this terrible dilemma between a rock and a hard place. Does she kill herself, or does she do the one thing that would, she wouldn't do? Well, that's the carers assessment. All you get under this act is an assessment. You then look back at his care package and you say, is that sustainable? And the answer is, of course it's not sustainable. She can't carry on doing that. And what happened in that case was the local authority said to her, look, we'll put some help in to get him up in the morning, put him in bed at night, and we'll give you a sitting service once a week, 3 hours or something, so that we will do some of this. And curiously, that was enormously important for her because it took the strain off her. She realised there was a middle way, that it wasn't sort of, a stroke or a care home, but the local authority would put in, and the local authority said, we would provide more if needs be. And that just took all the pressure off her in a way, although I thought it was quite a small input. So the outcome of a carer's assessment is not the carer gets anything, because in my view, she didn't need anything. It was his needs that were met a different way. He got the same amount of care, but not all from his wife. So the idea of a care assessment is not radical. It's just that his needs are met. Okay.
Excuse me, sorry, can I just ask, is that funded if once that assessment has been made? Because that's a big issue that...
Well, once he's assessed as needing that, once that is needed, he has a right to these services. He could be charged for those services because these are community-based services. She can't be charged, obviously, but he could be charged and would probably be charged, depending on his income. And, of course, charging is becoming the big problem because it's so substantial. Because local authorities are so short of money, it's being cut by government. They're looking around and charges are coming up all the time.
But apart from the charges element, the fact that there's kind of feeling about whether, people have over £22,000.
Yeah, I mean, you're a self-funder, and that's a problem.
Because that does even more distress than
Well, often that's the big issue. The local authorities say, well, you're going to have to pay for this, or we don't do it because he's a self-funder. In that case, they couldn't say they wouldn't do it because, of course, he lacked the capacity to sort it out himself, and she doesn't have to do that. But yes, the self-funder is a huge problem. The only way we're going to sort this out is by having free social care, which is what you have in Scotland, of course. And Scotland have done that without raising taxes. It would cost us, the Royal Commission says, 1.7p income tax, about £2 billion. We will have it. As sure as eggs is eggs, it will happen. But at the moment, it's a huge problem. The new social care bill will provide for local authorities to help self-funders. But of course, they still have to pay. But it is a huge problem, yeah. The proposals from what we call the Dilnot Commission was to put the cost threshold up to 100,000. But of course, the government's as keen on Dilnot as it is on Leveson. So I'm not going to go through. I'm not going to go through young carers much, but just to say that we fought very hard to get young carers in. So it's when a disabled person of any age is being assessed and there's a carer of any age. And so that could be a 5-year-old or a 10 or 15 or 115. It's age neutral. The new bill that's being proposed has got really will just be for adults, so it will cause havoc for young carers. And on my website, I've got a paper we've written about that. But I think the government will change its mind. But at the moment, all the benefit, all the gains we've made for young carers could be lost if the bill isn't amended. Then in 2000, I'm going to accelerate now, but we're nearly there. In 2000, another bill comes along, and this is called the Carers and Disabled Children Act. Again, it's actually technically a private member's bill, although in fact the government drafted this, but used Tom Pendry's slot in the private member's ballot to push it through. The government wanted to strengthen the law for carers because it had promised in the 1997 election manifesto that it would strengthen the law for carers. This is the Blair government. Why did Blair want to strengthen the law for carers? It's neoliberalism. It's the third way. It's, these are the group of people that do stuff. They're not capitalism, they're not communism, they just do it sort of free. We now call it big society, don't we? But this is sort of very much part of the lingo. The other thing you've got to remember about this, and it's worth realising, because it does actually make a big difference. Blair was a carer. When he was 12, his father had a stroke. His father was a barrister. His father lost his voice, lost the ability to speak. His father never worked again as a barrister. And for 2 years, the Blair household did care big time. So Tony Blair was and does get caring. When the 95 Act came out, I wrote a book about that. I write books on everything. He wrote the foreword to that, and he wasn't a big cheese then. He was not, the hated figure that he is today. So Blair gets caring. Gordon Brown's got a profoundly disabled child who's going to get worse and worse unless something miraculous happens in science. Cameron, of course, had the most profoundly disabled child who died. And it is very important when you're trying to push this stuff through, that factor, because it's quite an interesting factor that Brown or Cameron or Blair are not so crass as to say, I'm going to prioritise carers because I was one. But the group of people around them, those sort of vile people around them, they call it the cabinet, I think, or these toadies, they know that caring is close to Gordon's heart. They know caring is close to David's heart or Tony's heart. And they know that if they support these bills, they will get reflected support, the thick of it sort of stuff. And so we have always, with carers, I mean, I've got a bill going through at the moment. It's not going to get through, but they're going to use some of this, somebody called Barbara Keeley. They are very, they're hesitant about being anti-carer because of the big vote, 6.5 million, because it's the third way, but also we have a very unusual period with quite senior politicians with quite significant caring responsibilities. So anyway, there's Tom Pendry. He's not quite so pretty as Malcolm was. All this bill does is do two things. It says a carers can be assessed even if the disabled person's not being assessed. Sometimes, not unfrequently, you get people with mental health problems who refuse to have anything to do with social services. The local authority can now assess the carer even though there's nothing, they've got no contact with a disabled person. And this brought in services for carers. I'm not going to go into services very much. It's only a power. At the moment, when a local authority assigns a carer needs a service, not the disabled person, a carer. They have a power to provide that service. Under the new Health and Social Care Bill, that will be made into a duty, so that there will be it'll be a more I'm not sure it will add up to a tin of beans, but it is a better situation. What are carer services? Well, they're not respite care because that's given to the disabled person. Carer services is a thing you just give to the carer. I think I'm very rude about them. I think they're tokenistic, symbolic. They're cheap, generally. You give the carer some travel assistance today, for instance, to pay for carers to come to a meeting. You give them training. I was somewhere the other day and they've given them resilience training. I love this. You're giving carers resilience training because it's going to be so hard. You're going to need to toughen up. Relaxation therapy, counselling, mobile phones, so the carers can go out and phone back in or be contacted. Trips, holidays, special events. Surrey's just flown a family to Disneyland, don't ask me about it. Driving lessons, gardening just for the carers. I'm very rude about these because they are cheap, like all these other things. But curiously, they're highly valued. All the research shows that carers do value this. Often now carers are being given personal budgets of £100, £200. I think that's a real cop-out, but in fact it's highly valued.
Are carer services means then?
At the moment they're not. So carer services, these generally, I mean there are one or two local authorities, I doubt if Shropshire charges these, generally these are free. With the new bill they will become routinely charged for, which is really retrograde.
And is it just those things?
No, it's anything. It's anything that would help the carer care for. There's, as I say, sorry, it could be anything. I mean, I got a garden fence for somebody once. There's the greatest book written in social care, in my view, in the last 50 years is a thing called The Gift Relationship, which is about blood donation. Why do people give blood? Is it Michael Timmins? Anyway, it's an extraordinary book. It's quite old. It's out of print now. But he looks at why people give. And of course, often we write our name so they know we've given, and there's all this sort of stuff. But of course, with blood donation, you don't. And he looks at how. I mean, it's great for me because, of course, it shows in the UK we give blood, we don't get paid for it. Blood in the UK, 96% of it is used. It's very cheap because there's a national service. It's very high quality. In America, you pay for it. They've commodified blood. There is a market in it. It's incredibly expensive because everybody is buying and selling it. Very low quality because people lie about their health because they do it to get money for drug addiction and other things. And 96% of it is wasted. So it's the idea about commodifying things. Doesn't always a very good idea. But he talks a lot about why do people give and the symbolic value. I mean, come and do your social care masters, but come and do a PhD part-time at law school. And just do one, just very interested, there is a symbolic nature to services. You know, people value an assessment, a carer's assessment, enormously. Just sitting with somebody, the empathy, the quality of an assessment. You can't quantify that and say, oh, it's 13%, it's 3 billion. There are things that have a quality that empower and sustain people, just relationships in a way, that you can't put into money. And that's why I'm very unhappy about commodifying, putting a figure on assessments and things like that. Anyway, these are valued, even though I look at them and think they're small value, small cost, there is a value to them. So local authorities should review that decision, perhaps. I'm not going to go into parent carers either, but parent carers are covered by all this legislation because it's a carer of any age caring for a disabled person of any age. So parents of disabled children have a right to a carer's assessment. Often it's not going to be necessary because the disabled child's going to have an assessment, a carer's assessment. But if the children's team's saying, well, we're not going to let you go back to work because it's your kid, it's your responsibility, we're not a babysitting service, then the parent carer should ask for a carer's assessment because would then look at their needs. Very quickly finishing now, another bill comes along in 2004. This is again when I drafted. Finishing now, another bill comes along in 2004. This is again when I drafted, but this got massacred by the Brown-Blair government, who I hate more than anybody else in the world. We tried an MP called Hal Francis, a very lovely man, MP for Swansea. He came second in the ballot in 2003. He had a child, Sam, who died when he was 15, had cerebral palsy. So we drafted a bill, but there we were trying to sort of bring carers into the equality legislation, effectively. The thing we wanted to do with this was to amend the Disability Discrimination Act, largely. That's why it's called the Carers Equal Opportunities Act. We wanted to amend the Disability Discrimination Act to bring it in line with other discrimination legislation. Discrimination legislation says normally it's unlawful to discriminate against somebody on grounds of, and it can be anything but say race, or association with race. So if I were married to a black woman and I was refused a job, I could claim race discrimination, although it's her race that was the operative factor. So all we wanted to do was to harmonise that and to say it's unlawful to discriminate on grounds of disability or association with disability. Because many carers are in a bad health, wealth, well-being situation because they are indirectly discriminated against, because they cannot work because of disability. They cannot go and see the doctor because of their caring responsibilities. So it's the association with disability. And the Blair-Brown government refused that, Patricia Hewitt in particular, for which I bear a grudge. So all we got in this was there's a duty to provide information. So since then, I think local authority information services have probably improved and often have carers organisations doing that. There's a duty to discuss with carers whether they want to work or undergo education, training and leisure activities. And a duty to cooperate with the NHS. It didn't do a lot, but it sort of indicated the next phase of the campaign, which was to get sort of carers discrimination legislation and to make carers not just the responsibility of social services, but education and health and Tesco's, really, just like disabled people are today. But we failed there. Now, what happened quite surprisingly was, although we failed, a case was taken under employment law that did succeed. In the year 2000, the European Union passed a directive which binds all 27 European Union countries, saying that it's unlawful to discriminate in employment on grounds of sex, race, disability, but also age, sexual orientation and religion. It's called the Equal Treatment Framework. And a set of very good employment lawyers who understood this, and I didn't understand this, took a case for somebody called Sharon Coleman. Sharon is got a disabled son. At the time this happened, Oliver was 7. And she worked for a firm of solicitors who were pretty brutal. And she was bullied, basically. Oliver's got disabilities, he's got breathing difficulties, and so he has to take time off work. She had to take time off work. Sometimes sometimes predictably, but sometimes unpredictably. And they just gave her a very hard time indeed about this. Other people could take time off work, but she was victim, and it's the only, my students love reading it because it's the only European Union judgment that's got the F word 4 times. Because, they were just saying, you're effing child this and you're effing child that. So she eventually had to give up work. She did them for constructive dismissal. Now, of course, she loses under British legislation because the only thing she could use was the Disability Discrimination Act, and as I've already said, that makes it unlawful to discriminate against a disabled person on grounds of disability. Sharon's not disabled. But the Equal Treatment Framework Directive made it unlawful to discriminate against a person for a prohibited ground. And she wins on that because she was treated badly because of disability. So suddenly, carers in 2008 were held to be protected by association. That was quite a breakthrough. And there we see that picture I was talking about earlier. We see Michael Oliver's book. This is the classic example of a disabled social model of disability. He can't vote, not because he's got no use of his legs. He can't vote because of the environment we've created. We have disabled him socially. But it seems to me that you could get a sort of similar image for carers. Now, this probably wouldn't work because the carer can run in and then vote and run out. But if it was, I don't know, he needed a CT scan or a radiology, then that would be difficult because they'd have had to have made arrangements beforehand because this was going to take time. Carer can't access these services because they are handicapped by the disability. They have to make sure that the person in the wheelchair is being looked after. I mean, GPs often used to say, I don't think they do it anymore, say you had to make an appointment on the same day to see a GP. Well, that's very hard for carers who have to sometimes make appointments 2 or 3 days earlier because they need to make these arrangements. So carers are disabled, effectively, from accessing quite a lot of services because they can't do it without having to already accommodate disability. Now, really finishing, because of the European Union judgment, the law was changed. The law had to be changed because the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg is binding on the British courts. And so Section 13 of the Equality Act, which repealed the Disability Discrimination Act, the Race Relations Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, all those acts have gone. We now have a single Equality Act. And that Section 13 of that says that it covers people by association. So it's now unlawful to discriminate against somebody against disability, or age, or sexual orientation, or religion, or by association. So we now are in a situation where carers are beginning to be protected under the equality legislation. If you'd said to me in 1970 that disabled people were going to have disability discrimination legislation, I'd have said you were mad. I would say, no, I mean, I can understand sex and race, although, of course, those only came in the 60s. But obviously it's wrong to discriminate on grounds of race and sex because those are irrelevant factors for most activities. But disability is different. Disability, you can't do certain things if you're a disabled person. If you're blind, you can't be a driving instructor. I don't want to be brutal, but it's a fact. There's lots of things disabled people can't do. So it's different to sex and race. And so in the 70s, I would have said very clearly, disabled people are not the subject of discrimination legislation. But of course, we now say they are. And we all think it's obvious that they are because the social model made us look at it differently. When I say carers are going to have rights under the equality legislation, just like disabled people, because at the moment they only get it vicariously by association, people say, oh, no, that's not right, because carers are different. Because it's obvious that disabled people, sex and race are different, because that's innate. You can't do anything about it, whereas carers is choice. Well, I don't know about that. most carers don't talk about choice, choosing to be carers. Most people talk about caring a bit like disabled people talk about disability. But of course, we've now extended discrimination legislation to include age. Well, maybe you can't choose age. I wish we could, but you can't. Sexual orientation, well, sexual orientation is quite complicated. Maybe that changes. But we also include religion. And of course, religion, for me, is a choice. I mean, I think people choose it. I've got a sister that's had 4 different religions. So the idea that you're hardwired into religion, I think, is stretching it a bit. So we have extended equality legislation to include non-innate factors. And of course, carers can argue that they are discriminated, not because of, but they are included because of the social model. It is society that is disabling, the very bad way society is treating them. And that is very similar to the way disabled people would articulate their experience. So, we're there, 20 past. Sorry, you've all been very quiet. Probably desperate for the loo. I don't know if there's any brief questions, but we've got to our allotted period. Okay.
Can I just say, carers are not volunteers,
No.
they're constricted.
Yeah. I think that's a much better thing. Yeah, it's forced, coerced labour. It's not slavery, but it's forced labour.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. It's been Anyway, thank you very much for listening. It's been Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. When I knew that I was going to have to do the closing remarks today, I went and had a crafty look at Luke's website, and I suggest that if you've got access to the internet, you do that, because there is an awful lot of information, free information, out there, which I think you will find very valuable to back up all the notes that you've taken this morning. The big surprise for me this morning was that I had never, ever in my own mind associated paragliding with Marxism. So I'm going to have to go and think about that a bit. But it is really refreshing to have somebody talking to us who has a very strong conviction, a personal moral view about something that is deeply felt by all of us, and is prepared to challenge the political status quo, challenge the tabloid idea of what social care is about, and to actually, from my point of view as a teacher, to be able to hold an audience for an hour and a half without a break, an audience who are all leaning forward, wanting to hear more, taking notes, not embarrassed about asking questions. It just shows you the amount of engagement that Luke has been able to get from his audience this morning. So, on behalf of all of us here, thank you very much. It was really inspiring.